I'm Cathy McGowan, and I'm coming to you from Benalla in northeast Victoria. And I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of this country and right around Australia, and say a warm thank you to everybody, particularly our Indigenous community, to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders for their care of country, and looking forward to a really healthy result at the referendum. But I'm going to get underway because people have got together, and as way of introduction, I'm going to give each of the MPs a chance to introduce themselves in just a second. But just to talk about what this session's about, we're going to be looking at what makes for a healthy political ecosystem. And that's the topic for today. And we're going to focus on what the role of community is in creating a healthy political ecosystem. And no one better than our MPs, who now are really experienced in what the ecosystem looks like, to give us their advice on how to make it healthy and what we as community can do in our communities, in all our organisations, to actually build over the long term, make Australia better by putting community at the centre of politics and building this ecosystem. So this session goes till 5 to 11. It's going to be in 3 parts. The first is an introduction where each of the MPs get to talk to us about what's happening in their electorates. And then we're going to have a bit of a general discussion from the perspectives of the MPs. What is a healthy ecosystem? What are we working towards? What would it look like? And then having that general discussion, we're going to focus on, well, what are the KPIs? What really as a community would give us that sense that things are getting better? What do we need to pay some attention to? Now, we haven't had this discussion before, so I'm really looking forward I'm really looking forward to bringing out these ideas and a really rich discussion with these wonderful, wonderful MPs. So let's get going. I've asked Kate Chaney over in Perth to start the ball rolling. Morning, Kate, over to you.
Thank you very much, Cathy, and it is an absolute pleasure to be here. So thanks for having me today. I wanted to talk about something we're doing in Curtin. We're preparing a Curtin Pathway to Net Zero plan, and as part of that, we've asked people in the community to join one of our 5 working groups. And so we've ended up with 5 working groups around topics like building, energy, greening, and transport. And so they are actually coming together to do 2 things. Firstly, they are actually working on a community project, so something really hands-on, like measuring emissions at the local schools to talk about, why, in order to raise awareness about why active transport is a better option. And then they're also working to pull together all the policy asks that we have at a state, federal and local level to understand what it will take for our community to actually transition to net zero. And I've been amazed by the level of expertise that has come out of the community. And what I've realised is often people just need permission. So there's all this expertise there. People have so much to offer. And I've realised that it's my role really just to facilitate that that sense of permission, that it is actually everyone's responsibility, and I am not an expert on all these things. So they're meeting fortnightly. People have popped up with all sorts of really specific expertise, as well as citizens who are just interested and enthusiastic supporters. And what we've found is the combination of community organising and community connections plus some expertise around the topics means these groups are really well positioned to come up with a plan and really help give me a mandate to be seeking particular policy outcomes at a federal level, but also give them permission to then be going and seeking those things from their own representatives at a state and local level. And so giving that permission, I think, is something that an MP can do, but already at least one of those groups is talking about, well, do we spin off and do this separately so that there are things that we can do that we can't necessarily do if we're connected with me? Because I'm being very careful about things like endorsing particular businesses in the area that provide services that help people decarbonise. So it may be that these actually turn into groups that have their own life, which I'm really thrilled about. I wanted to mention one other thing before my 3 minutes is up, which was physical space. So in our election campaign, we had a Japanese restaurant as our campaign office, and it literally had paper-thin walls. And it meant that when people walked in, there was this sense that they were in the thick of it immediately. And I think that built that sense that this is our campaign. And if you walk in the door and you've got any skill, you actually need to come in and get involved and roll your sleeves up. That wasn't sort of a secret, separate area for the important people. And so I think, physical space can make a really big difference too in giving communities that sense of joint ownership. And I'll leave it there because I know time's tight.
Okay, just before you go, can you just tell us again, what was the question you asked? The task?
What the communities?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so they were doing, we asked, like, what would it take on this particular aspect of decarbonisation, like greening, for example, or transport? What would it take for our community to decarbonise at a local, state and federal level? And what can we actually do? The second thing is a community project. What can we actually do, not relying on government, to progress towards that? So we've got, one group that's doing native garden design for front verges, one group that's doing active transport stuff. And yeah, I'll leave it there. I could go on for hours.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe as we finish, you might actually put those questions in the chat. They're really, really good questions. But okay, passing over to you, Helen Haines, my federal member. Lovely to have you here. Looking forward to you talking a bit about what's your favourite project in Indi where the community's helping create a very good ecosystem.
Well, thanks, Cathy. And I love what Chaney has just said. And good morning to all my parliamentary colleagues. Most importantly, good morning to all of the people online. I can see 172 people, hearts and thumbs going everywhere, really encouraging. So a rice paper revolution clearly happened in Curtin. I think that Japanese restaurant could serve as a most excellent analogy for engaging with community, in that really the walls of privilege and power should be paper thin, actually. They shouldn't be an impenetrable barrier to getting engaged, and it shouldn't just rely on a handful of people. So Kate's just given us a marvellous example. I want to just take a quick kind of helicopter snapshot to say it's fascinating being a second-term Community Independent MP and watching the transfer from one government to the next. And I think if we're talking about a healthy political ecosystem, we should never forget that that transfer of power happens very seamlessly in Australia. So I just want to acknowledge that at the outset. I think if I was to look at what's happening in Indi, I want to acknowledge that what's happening in Indi has built on the work that Cathy began, and what I guess I've been able to do is take that along that pathway a bit further. So there's multiple projects that are community-led in Indi and that I think demonstrate a healthy political ecosystem. And I'd say the first thing about that is that there's an understanding in Indi now that it's not just about elections that you get engaged with your political ecosystem, that it's most importantly between elections, and that builds capacity for when an election comes. So I think what I've seen across several groups, and I'm going to start with telecommunications, because in Indi, rather than one community action, we have multiple communities in multiple small towns separated by mountains and valleys. So there's some really discrete issues that individual communities pick up and run on. Telecommunications was begun in the town of Mansfield, where Mansfield community said we'd be much better at getting solutions to our mobile phone black spots if we worked together. Cathy picked up on that and then formed a bigger group across all of Indi, which I've continued, called the Indi Telecommunications Action Group. And from that has spurned a whole network of people who help me identify where mobile phone black spots are. So we have a comprehensive map. They work together with me and the telecommunications companies and NBN, so that when telecommunications grants are available from government, we're ready to go. They've engaged with me through the committee process. So we have community members who engage in committee hearings as witnesses and put in submissions coming from everyday people, not from me as the MP. I put them in as well, but I think it's been a really good example of how the community can embrace a local problem, engage with the political process through grants, through committee hearings, through applications, and through each other to build a really powerful ecosystem in trying to get a solution to telecommunications. The other example I want to give is on community energy, which is well known in Indi, but our community energy work means that we have one of the most engaged communities in the nation in generating and distributing local energy and benefiting from it. Their engagement then with Cathy and then with me has meant that we have embraced the opportunities through government. So just in the last parliament, around $5 million has come into Indi, not just for a community battery or a program to enable solar on roofs, but also for research. So we've been engaged in something called Project Edge, where we've mapped our energy needs and our capacity to generate and distribute locally. That's now positioned us beautifully for the federal government's second round of community batteries. So we're ready to go on that. I'll be pretty disappointed if we don't get some community batteries funded through the feds into Indi, because the work has been done and enabled us to be ready to pounce on the opportunities that government puts forward. So there are two examples. Later on in the program today, you're going to hear from Better Benalla Rail and Northeast Rail Alliance, and that's one to look out for, because I think the thing that makes a great local political ecosystem is the transferability of skills, the building of allies, and people learning how to be effective in one topic area and taking it to the next. And I've seen a lot of crossover now happening across our community on particular issues.
Helen, was there any particular question you asked?
I guess the question I ask is, when people approach me, is what have you done already and what are you planning to do? And how do you see working with me on this? So I always go to that, because I think that just is a little wake up to anyone approaching my office with a particular problem to think, okay, Helen hasn't got all the answers. We've probably got a whole lot of them ourselves. So how do we work together?
Oh, that's great. Thank you very, very much. Zoe, hello from Goldstein. Lovely to have you on board. Good morning.
Good morning, Cathy. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here, and it's fantastic to see such a great audience. It's really interesting to hear Kate and Helen's reflections, and I think they intersect with a whole lot of similar things that we're trying to do here in Goldstein, and it really is still an evolution 1 year in, just trying to continue that momentum from the campaign into action. I think part of my process, Cathy, has been born out of a conversation with you actually before the election, where you spoke in a similar way to what Helen has described around enabling community to achieve things rather than being sort of little Miss Fix-It on everything. When people come in saying, what can you do for me? My question has been, well, what can we do together, and how can I help facilitate that process? So there are several projects that we have underway. One is also a community energy project. So our Village Zero pilot, which we're doing in Sandringham, was built out of an idea from me before the election that I framed to a couple of members of our community, one who works with a philanthropic organisation and the Sandringham Village Traders Association, to say, how about we make Sandringham our net zero pilot shopping village in Goldstein, because we have several little shopping villages, particularly along the Bayside Strip. And the beauty of that has been that from that germ of an idea, just putting the right people in the room, facilitated by me, they have now taken it on themselves. And I have really tried to stay arm's length from it in much the same way Kate describes, because there are some commercial interests involved. But the beautiful thing about it is just to see that grow and start to bloom, in that it's to do with getting solar on both commercial and residential rooftops. It's to do with green spaces, community gardens, and it's to do with zero waste. And it's also to do with community organisations, business and residents working together to achieve an outcome that can be translated across the various commercial shopping villages in Goldstein and also to the residential areas. So where we are with that is that there is not only a community battery application sort of underway with ARENA, but a network battery application, and a whole lot of other grant funding applications have already flown into that group and are in process. And that's something that they're driving themselves. So it's now a case of me just dipping into that group now and again. How's it going? What more can I do to help facilitate? And sort of being involved as a participant and observer rather than having to drive it. The other really cool thing is the CRISP refugee pilot, which I have a strong interest in refugee policy because of my background as a foreign correspondent. So and that's something that I spoke about a lot in the lead up to the election. So the refugee pilot program, CRISP, actually came to me and said, would you like to pilot this in Goldstein? And our way with that was to bring community together into a room to say, okay, we want to bring refugee families to Goldstein. It's not an area that has a vast number of refugees, very expensive area to live, obviously, and therefore perhaps not as culturally diverse as some other areas of Melbourne. But do we want to welcome refugee families into our community? And it was another case of just putting the right people in the room and saying, how can we do this together? And we now have 4 committees who are working to bring refugees into Goldstein, and we've had 1 refugee family already arrive from El Salvador, and we have families from Afghanistan also coming in the next few weeks. So again, it was more of a facilitation exercise of me bringing people together in order to say, what do you want to do and how can I help you to do it? So both things still a work in progress, but I think a good example of community-driven activity rather than top-down.
So there's a theme, thanks Zoe, there's a theme coming through of community organising and then the MP becoming the facilitator into the system that goes with it. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Monique, I want to say welcome to you. I haven't had a chance to say hello, but lovely to see you. Thank you. So we're talking about, as a way of introducing you to the 170 people on board, about putting community at the centre of creating a healthy political ecosystem. So tell us a bit of what's happening. So you can introduce yourself as well, but what's happening in Kooyong?
Well, thank you. I'm the member for Kooyong. We're doing something similar in terms of a community project aimed at electrification. So helping people with electrifying their homes and identifying best ways to support that. We're particularly interested in, there's a market increase in recent years in the high density housing in Kooyong. So there's lots of apartment buildings, there's lots of renters who just can't work out how to afford to electrify their homes, and also look at things like energy efficiency of rental properties, which is an area that we probably don't look at quite as much as we could. So we've set up a community group aimed at that. We're going to be doing a big expo in the next few months. We're setting up a project to support renters and people who own rental facilities in improving the energy efficiency of their homes and doing some cost effectiveness assessments of that. I would say it's a really useful project, and it's something there's a lot of enthusiasm for. One of the challenges is dealing with local councils and other organisations locally, both in terms of a certain degree of reluctance to engage, some reluctance in engaging with the subject matter, but also some sensitivities around the role of the local member. and the local members' relationships with other elected representatives within the electorate, whether that be at a state or at a council level. And that is a bit of a challenge actually on an ongoing basis. We've also set up a number of community groups out of the electorate office looking at advising me on areas of interest, which include GP services, Medicare, NDIS. We've got a youth group which is really actively focused right now on the voice referendum, but also really interested in some moves to drop the voting age that we'll be working on in the next year or two. There's a number of other community groups, reference groups that we've set up. I think the challenge there is that we've found that the organisation of most of those and the ongoing administration of them says to fall back to the electorate office, and we have limited capacity for that. And so we could probably, what we're really looking for, we've done this with our Native Forestry Advisory Group, is people who are incredibly passionate about something who are able to pick it up and run with it with the support of the office, but to do the day-to-day admin of that themselves, because we just lack the capacity for that. So we have lots of ideas and lots of things we'd like to be doing, but the struggle is finding people who feel that they're able to take that and run with it for us, rather than expecting the electorate office to take on the majority of that administration.
Thanks, Monique. And I think that's a challenge we'll probably talk about, because if you're having a healthy ecosystem, it needs to be able to regenerate itself. It needs to have that sort of own life force. Okay, we'll come back to that. Sophie Scamps, lovely to have you. Thanks for hosting us. Thanks to Kylea. It's great to be in your sort of virtual neck of the woods. Tell us what's happening in your area.
Thanks so much, Cathy. It is wonderful to be here, and hi to everyone again. In Kylea, we're also doing those things with electrification and Solar My Home, and also we're doing starting up a project which is Solar My Surf Club. So that can be a bit of an example to lots of people in the community about, what they can do in their own homes. But I wanted to chat today about what we're doing with young people, because before the last election, so many people were feeling cut out and shut out of their democracy. But I think that was particularly true for young people. They felt totally disenfranchised. I still remember my own kind of sense of great frustration when you had all these young people coming together with the school strike for climate change, and they were told by the Prime Minister to go home, go back to school and let the adults deal with the problem. And in fact, the reason they were there was because the adults were not dealing with the problem. And that lack of action, where there's this awareness that there's this challenge, this crisis coming up, but your leaders are not acting on it, is a great source of distress. So in our, this is sort of in our campaign, but we really wanted to make a big effort to bring young people back into their democracy, so they felt that it was theirs and it would work for them, and actually it was their future that was being created, so they absolutely deserve to be heard. So that was a key aim in our campaign. So I think you might know we had, towards that end, we decided, how will we get young people in it? And Cathy, I remember you saying, what are you doing that's fun and joyful? What's in your electorate that you can use that's creative? And we are extremely blessed here in Kylea. It's got a long history of creative people, the artists, the writers, but also musicians. So we ended up holding this fabulous concert, and we knew that would attract people in, because we wanted to come to the young people where they were. And we had this wonderful concert that was extraordinarily joyful. There was lots of dancing and fun, and we had a comedian there as well. We're very lucky. We had Angus and Julia Stone, who are international artists. We had Lime Cordial, and we had other groups. And it was just such a great vibe where people felt that, yes, they're coming to us, they're listening to us, they're in our area, they're in our space. Maybe there is some hope for us. Maybe we can have a politician who actually listens to us and, try and bring that hope for the future. And it really was very successful. I've got to say that even since then, if I see a group of young people, they're so excited to see me, and it's purely because they felt like I would listen to them. There's selfies galore, even with young teens and young 20-somethings who you would think would never be engaged in politics. And they're so excited. So it was really wonderful. And we've tried to carry that through as well with having a youth advisory group like many of the others. And we've got that up and running, and was very excited a couple of weeks ago when there was the opportunity to make a submission on measuring what matters. So the Treasury is bringing in hopefully wellbeing indicators. So with our economy and our society, what actually is a measure of prosperity? Is it only the GDP, or are there other measures of prosperity? So really what we were able to do with this young group was ask them what type of future they would like to live in, or what they would like to create. And that was built into a submission that went directly to Treasury. And so it was an example to young people how they can be involved in their democracy far more than just on voting day, and you know, how they can be there helping to mould and shape our future. And it was a really wonderful experience. And that's the type of thing we want to build, that capacity with young people as well. So we're bringing them back into their democracy, and it's working for them. And just to sort of finish off that as well, we've got, again, with The Voice, we know that this is a huge issue for young people and the future of Australia that we create. So again, we're going to, hopefully, we're thinking about having another concert. So we're coming to young people, we're coming to all people, and we're doing it in a joyful, positive way. So people do feel connected with what's going on.
Great. Oh, so there's two things out of what you've been talking about, Sophie, that when we come and talk about the KPIs, I'd be really interested to hear about some of those. But I just love bringing joy and fun, because then it just takes away the hard work. It's a bit like saying a healthy political ecosystem is beautiful. And it's fun.
And joyful. And it's and that's the big thing. So many people have made those wonderful connections and felt joyful during the campaign and since. It's been great.
And I have to say, it's about any, you know, even the natural ecosystem. It's beautiful when it flourishes. So that's lovely. Okay, Kylea, hello. I know you're out and about. Give us a quick look at well, I shouldn't say Northern Beaches, North Sydney.
Good morning, Cathy, and good morning to everyone on the call this morning. I just want to say it's actually fabulous to have come in at this point of the conversation, because my colleagues are so inspiring. So it's just incredible to be a part of this group that currently sits on the crossbench in the federal parliamentary level. So thank you to everyone on this call today. I'm joining you from Camaragal land this morning, and I think, you know, for me, that's a big topic of conversation that's going across our electorate at the moment, because North Sydney is probably best described as a soft voting centre at the moment. What I would say, where I want to start this morning, is just by kind of encouraging this whole conversation to recognise that I often say to people in North Sydney, there is no me without we. So fundamentally, choosing to make the move to independent representation as an electorate is a commitment that goes well beyond just getting somebody elected. And it is a commitment that it takes time for your electorate to get their head around, oftentimes around that responsibility flowing not just from the actual campaign itself, but into the running of your day-to-day policy positions. You know, like I don't represent a party. So the people who inform me in terms of how I vote, what position I take when I stand up on the floor, they are the people who got me into this seat, and they fundamentally are normal Australians, like everybody on this call. So to me, a healthy democracy here in North Sydney has actually been a really significant shift. And it has started with helping people understand it doesn't just end with the campaign. It is a commitment that, just as I'm committed to serving this 3-year term, the people who got me here have to be committed to standing with me. That started right from the beginning of our campaign, in that, you know, one of our platforms we ran on was Net Zero North Sydney. And right from the beginning, I knew I struggled to put solar panels on my own roof. So, you know, being able to reach out to the community and say, I don't have the answers here, help me find them. And I have an extraordinary group of about 10 people who are perhaps some of the smartest in our country when it comes to energy policy, transport policy, policy for collaboration, who now they met and they developed a strategy for me. It took them about 3 months to develop that strategy. That strategy wasn't developed in isolation. They socialised it across the broader energy sector. They reached out to people like Gownell, Saul Griffith. They had input from experts across the country. And then they brought it back to me going, Kylea, these are the things that we think North Sydney could realistically do to get ourselves to be one of the first net zero seats. And they now continue to pursue that strategy. So we've since had a community fair. One of the things we're actually doing, and it comes a bit back, I can't remember what, I think it might have been Mon mentioned it, but one of the key focuses of that committee is actually to get the various levels of government working together. So there is a very important but subtle difference is if I, as the federal member, stand up and invite my local state members and my local council mayors to come to a meeting with me, there is automatically a sense of power application. You know, it's the federal member summoning the state and locals. Whereas because North Sydney Net Zero is driving this sort of initiative, it's actually the community that's inviting of us all into the room at the same time. So we have quite an important meeting coming up in this next week here in North Sydney, where it will be myself, the local state members and the local mayors. And we are convening because our community has told us they want the three levels of government to work together. So that's a really powerful move. And the only other thing I would say, and it's because it's particularly timely, anyone who follows politics would have seen in the last week, there's been a massive debate in the House of Representatives around the level of support that students carrying their debt are getting in our society. And it's poor this year, high indexation rate, indexation
Kylea,
of life.
Yeah, don't tell us a story. Can you just focus on what the community are doing? Because we know the issue.
65.
Yeah, so the community mobilised. So they actually wrote to me with their policy position. They have written to other parliamentarians. They helped me write my speech. They had input into the question I asked. And as a result, we've hit Friday and the minister is now saying that they will review that policy position. They'll prioritise it. So that's a community outcome.
Great. Okay, well, I'm going to come back and pick up some of these themes, but it's really lovely. Thank you, Kylea. So, Zali, hello. Lovely to have you. Thank you.
Hello. Good morning, Cathy. Good morning, everyone. I'll unmute myself. Wow, what a fantastic panel, and so good to see so many people online listening. Also, look, I think Helen and I have been around the block once already. And we've sort of got that benefit of being able to have a lot of things in place. I think as many have, there are so many issues on the table. We do have a more ambitious government that has a bigger agenda, and that I think in many ways translates to us as independents, where we can push that agenda further, but there is a willingness to work with us, which is important, and I think then achieves a lot more. So I think your question, healthy political ecosystem, for me, look, obviously agree with everything that's been said, but I think for me, it's about greater accountability of government, and that comes from greater engagement and awareness by community around opportunities, projects, policy areas. And to me, once you can get that accountability and awareness, you are empowering the community to have a say. And in this day and age where we have fairly big issues to resolve, from climate, global warming, geopolitical, cost of living, we're coming out of a period of COVID that was challenging for so many in the community. The best counterbalance to anxiety and frustration on those big issues is feeling empowered, and to feel empowered is to have that opportunity for engagement. So I think that's what our communities are really benefiting from, and I think that is the tidal wave sweeping across Australia. It's that desire to be empowered, that you're not just tapped on the shoulder for your vote every 3 years, but you actually own your vote and you will make it work for all that time in between as well. Project-wise, man, it's amazing. There's so much going on. But, you know, from The Voice, we've had amazing forums. We're engaging with our high school students. Remember, everybody, your Year 12 students, their first ever vote for many of them will be The Voice, which is historic for them, and they are incredibly excited. And we know from climate research that students are the most influential on their parents and grandparents. And the grandparents category is generally the one we need to work on when it comes to climate action, but also The Voice if we look at the demographics that have concerns. So incredibly important group. In Warringah, look, I think it's going from strength to strength. We have amazing organisations like Solar Alliance and Zero Emission Sydney North doing great work at helping more people in our community electrify. We just relaunched the Climate Act Now campaign, calling for a 75% emissions reduction by 2035. So check out the website, everybody, climateactnow.com.au. But with also very important information tips. So 5 tips how to do your bit in your household, and 5 tips for employers and companies to do their bit. Really important that we engage it at the micro as well and get everybody involved. We have great projects.
Zali, let me interrupt you. In a minute, could you put those links onto the chat so people who, particularly the kids, that'd be great. And perhaps just one more example. Yeah.
And look, also we are working with state government to electrify the Brookvale bus depot. It's been identified as one of the first bus areas to go electric. We had an electric bus for the campaign, so they've really taken that on board. So there's great things, but we can just never be complacent, and everyone has to keep engaging. You know, we are only I am representing the community. The community has to step up to its role and responsibility in pushing for better government.
Great. So in a minute, we're going to just sort of pull this together and just look at the ecosystem sort of category. But if you could, I think those kits that you're talking about, hugely useful, Zoe, Zali, particularly for people who don't have an independent MP. And Allegra, hello. I think you were out shopping with your children, but I am
here. I'm afraid I'm between basketball and somewhere else. So I'm hopefully going to get my video for later on, but right now I don't have it. Let's see if that works. But thank you so much for having me today. And a huge, I agree very much with Kylea. It is so exciting to be on the crossbench with such wonderful women and people as well. And also really exciting to have so many people across Australia really interested in how to drive a vibrant democracy, because this is so important. And Australia has a pretty good democracy, but it can be better, and it's something that we all have, I think, a important role really to protect and really empower. I'm going to give you sort of 2 different examples from Wentworth. So I'm from Wentworth, so Bondi Beach outwards is how I like to describe it quickly. And I think, so actually there are 3 different ways that I'm looking at saying, how do you empower that democracy? Firstly, on an example of on the environment. Interestingly, I was always very focused on climate, but I didn't actually, to be honest, know a lot about the environment as more of a broader movement beyond the sort of climate movement. It had always been much more the climate movement that I was involved in, and it's interesting that. Out of my campaign, which really brought lots of people together, we've grown a group within Wentworth called the sort of Environment Group for Wentworth, or they're effectively their own group. And what they do is they really run their own show, but they hold me accountable. So we sort of meet probably about roughly, whenever there are big issues that are up and important to them, and are also on the national phase, and they basically we get together and they do a lot of research. They will scrutinize my vote, they will give me feedback on really important things, and they also really educate me in terms of some of the most important environmental issues out there. And I think that's absolutely wonderful, because it's helped me grow, it's helped me stand up for what's important to the environment, but they're not dependent on me, and they can have different positions to me, but they really drive that. The second area is the voice, and it's a sort of a different example where we've started this group called Wentworth for the Voice, where we are trying to provide a structure for people to get involved and volunteer for the voice. And what's really interesting about that group is, again, I provided some of that catalyst, and my office has provided some of the sort of background structure and sort of some resources around it, but it is now is really volunteer led and driven. And we with the volunteers identified that the gap that we wanted to fill within Wentworth was bringing information to everybody so they could have access to information, and then also providing structured volunteering opportunities so people who care could actually turn caring into action. And I think that's just an example of saying, where identifying the gap, and this is where I think myself, but actually really the community identified where was the gap in that needed to be filled, and we identified that gap, and now it's actually people really driving that, and we're helping convene, but frankly it's the volunteers and it's the community who's really driving this. And the last example I'm going to talk about is around tax reform. Now, that's an area where it's a complicated issue to engage with, but it's interesting. It's an issue that many people in the community want to engage with, but it feels like such a big topic, and that it's difficult to engage with, and also the major parties have only created a very political sort of wedge culture in which to engage on tax. So this is one where sort of my approach of trying to invigorate our democracy is actually more about bringing people together with different ideas and putting them in the same room together and saying, where is the common ground? Now this is an area where I'm sort of really leading on sort of bringing people together again, and some of and really that process. But when I think about what is a healthy democracy, it's where people who don't necessarily see themselves as on the same side, who perhaps on certain issues really do disagree, but on other issues actually can really agree. And on many issues, probably most of Australia agrees on 80-85% of things. And so I think the opportunity on a great democracy is actually to look at where we look for our common ground, identify the common ground, and then where we don't agree, have a respectful conversation. And that's what I'm trying to do on tax. I'm trying to find the common ground and really advocate for reform in the common ground, and where there is not common ground, make a judgment call about what is better. But I think that's for me, that's a really important view on a vibrant democracy, is having a respectful conversation about areas where we don't agree, but also focusing very much on where we can agree, where we can work together, because I think the more that we do that on different issues, the stronger and more vibrant our democracy will be.
Allegra, that's perfect segue. So don't you go away. I can see your kids in the back and they probably need a bit of your time, but so we'll come back to you in a minute, because I actually want to talk about how you do that. So, oh my God, to be a recipient of what we've just heard, it just creates such joy. It makes all the work of what we're trying to do, all that campaigning work, all those years of effort, it just makes it so worthwhile hearing what you're talking about. And I'm sure it's just the tip of the iceberg. There's just multiplier effects. And there's so many people listening today who want a bit of that. Like I've just seen in the chat, the people of Deakin, which is Victoria, say, oh my God, we so need you. And I'll say to any people in Farah listening, you so need this as well. So I think what you're doing is just this spreading of ideas about why it's worth doing the work, because it is work. It really is work. And I want to talk, the next bit of this conversation is to try and, for the people listening who've got different communities and different electorates, what are some of the key things that communities can do in creating a healthy political environment? And before I come back to Allegra to start this one, I just want to talk about a book I've been reading called The Secret Life of Trees. And it's just a gorgeous story about how trees communicate in a forest. And I just wanted to bring this into this sort of metaphor into the discussion, because the trees communicate at their root level. They communicate by sending out different chemicals, so they communicate. And Zali, as you were talking, about the voice, I just love the idea of getting the young people to do their upward work with their grandparents. So that reminded me of the interdependence there. It's also like giving permission. Like, you've got to give people permission, because we've been so conditioned to not talk about politics, and it's a dangerous place. So that again comes down to Allegra of helping us work out, well, how do you create safe places to have conversation about difference? And then Helen and others were talking about planning. Like, you just can't have you've actually got to be able to get people together and have a plan so that it's not just arbitrary. You know, it's focused on a delivery, because it's got to be effective. If you're just doing busy work, people will drop out of it. They've got no time for it. And then the beauty of you, Sophie, about a concert. Oh, I just think that's probably imagine if we had a whole series of concerts around Australia for the voice. Instead of just doing argument, you know, working at the head, we just had a series of concerts. It would be just fantastic, I think. Anyhow, enough from me. So I just wanted to come back now, and I'll start with you, Allegra, and then anyone can jump in for about half an hour. So what we're really looking for is, what is this meaning when we put to a healthy democracy, a healthy political ecosystem? And what's the messages for communities? Not so much the message for you guys as MPs. So Allegra, in the work you've done in bringing together people, of deliberately bringing to people together of difference, what can you share with us for communities?
Look, I'd start with the piece is that don't be afraid of people with different opinions. And I mean that really deeply, deeply sincerely. And I think because, you know, there's an old expression from, I think, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is seek first to understand and then to be understood. And I think that for me is, you know, I think it's a way to live your life. But I think also, so don't be afraid. You know, you do need people who are operating in good faith. But I would say most people in this country do operate in good faith. And so I think that, you know, for me, this question of bringing people together is, you know, assume that there is actually a broad common ground. But it is also important about how you frame the question. And I'm going to talk about tax again as an example on this. So with our tax work, what we decided to do was, you know, we thought that the problem with tax, or the reason why tax ends up being is one of the reasons why tax becomes such a sort of sort of contentious subject, is because it's often tied to the sort of left and right, whether you want a big government, you know, raise a lot of money, or a small government and low tax. And the way that we're framing this is we're trying to separate the spending, which, you know, political parties have a strong view on, to, well, what's the best way to raise the money we need to spend on good things? And so we're trying to take we've narrowed the question from, you know, trying to say, well, what should our tax structure look like and how much should we raise, to go, we're not going to worry about how much we can raise. That's a separate question, and someone else can also manage that. We're going to work on what's the right tax structure. And we've also framed it for 2035. And the reason why we did that is because it sort of steps out of, you know, next week, should we, you know, stage 3 tax cuts, negative gearing, you know, some of the more sort of contentious and very political issues of the moment, and say, well, look, this is about the long-term future of our country, not just the next 10 minutes. And I think that, so those are probably my messages about, if you are trying to create that vibrant conversation and bring different people together, is one, you know, do deliberately bring people together. Like we looked at sort of the economists across the spectrum, and when we were putting together our first tax roundtable, we were very conscious about saying, okay, who's on the left, you know, or traditional left, who's on the traditional right? Do we actually have a balance in the room? Because I don't want this to be sort of just one way or the other. And very much also, how do we create a conversation, how are we going to create a space where we will be able to find actually quite a lot of common ground, and we believe there's a lot of common ground. And then to prepare for that conversation, we did a lot of background calls to start with, to make sure we understood where everyone was coming from, so we could also facilitate that discussion constructively, and we didn't sort of end up quickly in a rabbit hole where, you know, where people were fighting out their corner. So I think if you frame those things well, you can have conversations. They're never going to be perfect, and you will always have disagreement, but you can have some very respectful conversations where people are listening and learning from each other.
Allegra, did you have professional facilitators?
No, we didn't, but we did have people who were very good at facilitating in the room. But I think I think having a professional facilitator is also a great idea. Like I think you've got to start. I think if you actually come in with a truly open mind, and create that space for true openness, and so whoever's facilitating, I think, needs to really bring that into the space, I think.
Great. Okay, so if you, Allegra, when you get back to your office, probably maybe someone listening could actually put into our chat a link where people are interested in this, because it's really what you're talking about there is what's hard politics and really important work. But I'm going to go now. I'll go around the group again. So back to you, Kate. What's your sense of how we've talked about diversity, getting people who don't agree. There's that. There's sort of like what else in this sense of and for community groups in particular, as they're beginning the work, not just getting a candidate elected, but of making their democracy happen well. From your experience, can you distill some of the key things that really work? And I'll go around the group again, just like I did before.
So I think I understand the question. So what are the things that work other than diversity and getting communities engaged? I think so much of it is permission and people actually feeling like it's their job rather than that they come and tell me what the problem is and I go away and fix it. And it is difficult to build that. I have a brochure that sits in my office that I based on something that you said, Cathy, that I saw from you, Cathy, which is, if I care about an issue, what can I do? Laying out all the things that citizens can do, and I'm only part of that. So I try and sort of create that vibe before people come in. I mean, the challenge, the thing that worries me is that even when I do have, what feels like a large number of people engaged, there's still 170,000 people in my electorate who aren't engaged. And I'm very conscious that you end up in a bit of an echo chamber of the people who support the things that you stand for come and get involved and you don't hear the rest. So I don't know how to solve that problem, but I think all you can do is create opportunities and try and remind people that they have permission. And I like to remember that, Curtin Independent, which was the group that set up that, was looking for a candidate, started with two people having a conversation in a cafe. Neither of them had any political experience, but they decided to get a few other people together and then build a website and say, we're looking for a candidate. And actually, it just takes two people having a conversation. That's the only way anything can start. So you do have to just take that sense of ownership. And I think building that sense of ownership is such a cultural shift from how it's been done in our electorates in the past, that it's just a lot of conversations with people and that sense that, this is not somebody else's job.
Okay, there's a real goal there. So that sense of permission, so you've got a list of jobs. Again, someone might stick that up, ways people could be involved. So it's not just people have to make it up. You give them a bit of a guidance and you remind people that's actually their job. They have to do it. So Helen, I'm going to move to you now because you've had quite a lot of experience of doing this. I could dob in a couple of examples, but from your perspective, what have you seen that works?
Yeah, thanks, Cathy. And I agree with everything that has been said so far, particularly around permission. I would add that some of the value out of being an MP is networking people and assisting them to connect. Extraordinary privilege of being an MP is how much stuff you get to hear about, how many people you get to meet, how many events you attend, either as a participant or as some kind of leader. So we have a huge network of knowledge and connection that we can connect other people into. So I often do that. I often suggest to people who else they might want to give a phone call to and get together on, or what events they may wish to go to, and not just turn up, but actually turn up and be prepared to do some work. So I think what I'm hearing consistently from this conversation this morning is it's very much our role to challenge people to to not be passive in their engagement, to actually encourage them to do the work. And I think on that business of building collaborations and allies, the example that I just touched on in my opening remarks around railways, so much of rural and regional Australian politics is around infrastructure and what we do or don't have, or how infrastructure is always a big conversation in rural communities. Really, it's about what we don't have, what we'd like to have, or what's happening to us. The Inland Rail is a really good example. So the Inland Rail, we all know in this group, but more broadly across the listening audience, has been a nation-building project. It's had a massive cost blowout. It's been poorly planned. It's been exposed as having many problems. When it was coming, the work was happening in Indi, it was affecting several of my communities, and we had a lot of questions about the planning and the way that the community was engaged. People were very angry and didn't know what to do. We then saw some of the people who'd been engaged in the political process through campaigning for Indi put their hand up to say, we're going to convene a group of locals in our town. And they had a common issue that brought people of all political spectrums. And we've seen an allegiance grow called the North East Rail Alliance now, that has people from vastly different perspectives on climate, on health, on how they vote, on the voice. Like, they would disagree on so many things, but what they do agree on is that they want better input into how their local railway precinct is affected by a project that's been imposed upon them. We've been really successful. We've had rallies. We've brought the Deputy Prime Minister down here. We've seen our communities engage in a Senate inquiry, put in submissions, and have engaged with students, university students, to redesign what was offered to us from the ARTC, and we have succeeded. 2 of our railway precincts have been completely redesigned in the way that the community want them redesigned. Now, this happened by a transferability of skills, a building of an alliance. When people came to me individually, I said, I'm not going to deal with you individually. You need to team up as a group, and then we can work together. And they did. So I think, in summary, as an MP, what I'm hearing from my colleagues and what I completely endorse is we need to throw the challenge back. The challenge comes backwards and forwards. Community need to hold us to account for doing what they want us to do, and we need to throw the gauntlet back to them as well, to say, right, what are you going to do? And then provide network supports, facilitation, whatever we can do to enable that process to flourish.
So Helen, that's good, but my sense is if it doesn't, and I'm going to throw to you in a minute, Zoe, because when you get success, it builds on success. But if people have failure, if it doesn't work or it's too hard, they go, I'm not going to do that anymore. It just didn't work. So, yeah, Zoe, so we've had a bit of advice here, and I'll just what I'm hearing, it's these, you've got to find the interconnecting Venn diagrams. What's the bit in the middle that everyone's going to work on? So you've got to do that. You can't just be, but back to Zoe, you're skilled at bringing ideas together. Can you provide some advice to the people listening? Is they don't want to do busy work. They want what they're doing to actually be effective. So what's some advice you've got in the early stages of community groups getting going, that they can avoid doing this whole lot of work for no good outcome?
Yeah, thanks, Cathy. It's really interesting hearing Helen speak, especially as a second-time MP. And I must say, I often, I think a lot of us have a "what would Helen do" thing in the back of our minds as we're doing things. But look, I'd like to insert a bit of a reality check into the conversation, if you don't mind. This is bloody hard. This is really hard to actually bring all of these pieces together into something that moves forward. It's kind of like steering an aircraft carrier through the Port Phillip heads. It's really challenging. I mean, I had a professional community organizer as part of my campaign team. It took us 6 months to uplift that. We built the plane when it was already in the air, and it was really challenging even for her as a person who'd been doing this for 20 years to actually get the community all steering the ship in the same direction. And we got there, and it was amazing. And by far the most positive experience I have ever had in my life, having all of those people paddling the same way at the same time with the same aim in mind. Then the election happened, and the next day everyone went, oh my God, I'm so tired, and kind of disappeared. Not everyone, but most people. And that's absolutely valid. But of course, then we had to sort of build a spaceship and launch it into Parliament, and then try to continue all of that community involvement and intersection to achieve the outcomes that we want. You know, I'm finding this experience, again, the most positive thing that I've ever done, but also the most challenging. It's kind of like navigating an asteroid field 24/7 and trying to catch the meteors before they knock you off course. Because I think, you know, the amount of stuff that comes into our offices of people wanting you to do things, and as Helen has really well described, lots of individuals wanting you to do individual things, and trying to create that into a collective of issues that you need to prioritise and move forward, both at a community level and at a parliamentary level in a legislative sense, is a really complex and tricky balance. So what I'm working to do with my community is to clearly identify, and this is still a work in progress, but to clearly identify what are the priorities that we want to land. How do we stick to those tracks without constantly getting diverted? And then how do we land outcomes, or as Kate, you know, really articulately says, nudge that forward? Because, you know, you learn, I think, the day that you land in the Parliament, that achieving great leaps forward is extremely difficult. So a lot of it is just nudging the government and indeed the political system the way that you want it to go. So, you know, I think the great thing about this conversation is to talk about that evolution and how important not only getting an independent MP elected is, but how critical that relationship between the community and the MP is. Because, you know, arguably the community looks to the MP and says, I need you. And I look to the community and say, I need you more. You know, you guys are the ones that actually lift me to the position where I can create the action that you want.
So Zoe, before I pass it on to Monique for some comment, we love your analogies. Everyone's saying thank you for those metaphors. They're just fantastic. Keep them coming. But it also just reminds me, so the community groups who are tuning in today, who don't have an MP who's on their side, they've got to do the groundwork. Because what everybody's saying, it's you could launch the rocket, but if you haven't actually done the groundwork, the next bit doesn't happen, or might happen some other way. So I suppose it's worth building the platform, if I could take that idea, and making it solid. So we've got 2 years at least before the next election, so lots of time, Deakin and Farrer and other electorates to do the work. So Monique, what's your sense of all of this, out of the whole conversation, in terms of a healthy political ecosystem and a thriving democracy, and those medical examples that you could give us? What are they?
Medical examples. Oh my goodness. I'm just trying to get my head around Zoe's many metaphors. I'm not sure if I'm on an aircraft carrier or an asteroid or a rocket. Much of the time I do feel like I'm on something which is careering out of control. Yeah, look, I think I'm in furious agreement with everything that everyone else has said. I think it's really important, as Zoe has done, to emphasise the fact that for many of the community groups, you know, the focus might be on getting a representative elected, and that's, you know, an incredible thing to do, and an extraordinary thing to do, and something that many of our communities have done with great effect in the last couple of years. But that, as you and Helen know, is just the start of it, and Zali, the start of what we want to achieve. And so I think people really need to think about, well, what do we want, and why do we want it? And so if it's not just about getting us elected, it's about then helping us do what people feel passionate about. You know, obviously for most of us, it's climate, it's integrity, it's transparency, it's gender equity, and then other specific things. But if people feel really strongly about it, you can't drop the ball once the independent is elected. You then have to help that independents succeed. And there's kind of two bits to that. Firstly, it's achieving those aims that everyone wants, that we all feel incredibly passionate about, but it's also about proving the process. I mean, for me, one of my insecurities is I feel like if I don't get re-elected in 3 years, 2 years' time, 18 months' time, whatever it is, then that is suggesting to Kylea, or suggesting to some people, at least from external, that that the experiment hasn't worked, that it hasn't succeeded. I really feel like we need to have proof of, part of the proof of concept is demonstrating, as you have, as Helen has, and as Zali has, that it's a good fit for the electorate, and it is able to deliver for the electorate what they want. And so I think there's a real challenge for people, and I'm in the process. We're all in the process of working out these systems within our own electorates, of pushing it, not pushing it back to people, but saying, okay, if you want this, I'm here, I'm ready to go, but I need you to stay engaged, and I need you to understand that there are limits to what an independent can do. We can only take on so many things, as Zoe said. People come to you and say, I'd like you to do this, and you think, gosh, that would be really good, that's important. And then another 5 people in the same meet and greet will come to you and say, well, this matters to me, this matters to me. And they're all important things, they're all good things, but you can't do them all. So the community has to understand we have to focus down on the things that are achievable and important. And then we do need that ongoing commitment from people, not just to come back at the time of the next election. I know people will do that. They've been incredibly generous with their time and their expertise and their enthusiasm and their financial support as well, but also to remain involved during the interim, the medium.
So Monique, it's sort of like that's sort of like what we're saying about democracy. It's not just every 3 years voting. It's what we've been putting together. You've got to be I think Zali was saying it. You've got to pay attention to what government's doing. You've actually got to take responsibility. You can't just give away the trust, isn't it?
That's right.
So, okay, Sophie, what works? What's your bit of advice on all of this one?
I'm hearing everybody else as well. Is that you have to put in the hard yards early to find out what are the issues, the top issues that are important to the people in your electorate, and you do have to try and stay focused on and true to those. But we get so many things brought to us. This is exactly what the others are saying, which are so important, but you just can't take it all on. We have one political staffer each, one advisor each. So you can imagine there's a team of 2 of us trying to do enormous issues. And so I know that I was guilty of this for a long while, years prior to getting involved. I was looking around for other people to lead, action on climate change. I was looking for people to do something. And then I loved your saying, Cathy, when you used to say, there's no cavalry coming over the hill to save us, there's only us. And that's kind of an epiphany that I had as well. Actually, I've got to step up and do whatever I can as well. And often we hear, people saying, just write to your MP, and sort of leaving it there. But I loved what Kate had done, sort of empowering people to know what else they could do as well, because it's one thing to bring it to us, but you do need to keep holding. It's not enough just to bring it to us. You have to keep engaging and pushing it forward as well in your own ways. So I'd love to see your pamphlet, Kate. That sounds like a great idea. I'd also say the question that you asked was, what is a healthy ecosystem, democratic, healthy ecosystem for our democracy? I think we can see what an unhealthy ecosystem for democracy is, and that's probably in the US, where people are so divided that they actually can't have those conversations. So it's coming back to what Allegra was saying. How do we build that culture where people are feeling like it's safe, where it's okay to have those conversations? And I would contrast that with what happens in Switzerland. I have a good friend who's Swiss, and saying, well, they're brought into their democracy all the time. They are constantly having referendums on issues, local issues, state and federal. And it's come to the point where actually that people just have conversations or discussions over coffee. What do you reckon? Well, what do you think? So they have these really healthy debates, and it's completely normal and part of their culture. And I've seen a lot of comments in the chat as well. We said we do have that culture in Australia where we were conditioned not to talk politics. So it absolutely does come down to permission. And Cathy, and in I think that kitchen table conversation model and continuing that throughout the throughout the term is really, really important, because it's building that culture where it's okay to talk politics, because you're not just talking politics, you're talking about issues, what's important to you and what solutions you would like to see. And so we've still got a voices group that is actually separate to what I'm doing, because, it's their role to continue to engage the community. And I think that's really, really important. And what Allegra is doing, bringing people with opposing views into the same room to have those respectful conversations, is absolutely a sign that our democracy is healthy. And that's where we've got to move forward, those respectful, healthy conversations where we're looking for solutions, not just difference. Oh, Cathy, you're on mute.
Yeah, so that's really useful, isn't it? So supporting our MPs, taking responsibility, and then having the difficult conversations. And then that sense of, if we had regular referendum, we wouldn't be in such a tiz, because they never work, because we'd be more used to having them, and we'd probably have a different success, might be quite useful. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so Kylea, do you want to add your 2 bobs to this conversation?
I would like to add a couple of things to the conversation. And we're very fortunate today. We're surrounded by people who are actually highly politically engaged and well informed. And I think one of the things when you're working in this space that I like to try and remember is that actually that probably only represents about 1 in 10 Australians at the moment. 9 in 10 are disengaged. And from my experience, a large part of why they're disengaged is because they don't feel like anyone listens. So actually, I think a really important part of getting any initiative up is showing that to do politics independently is to make a commitment to listening first, and then working with that group and that person to be able to move a debate forward. Because I think that for me, when I reflect on that first sort of 6 months of campaigning, and even now, the most common response I get from people is, I can't believe you listened to me, that you responded to me, that you actually took on board what I'm saying and are helping me find a way forward.
But Kylea, let me interrupt. So that's you. How do you get your community to listen? So it's not just...
Well, I think it's about starting the conversations, Cathy, because I actually think the other thing that is appalling in our country is civics education. Like, people don't understand the difference between a federal, local and state government position. That a lot of people in this country don't understand what a referendum is. I was talking to a Labor member who was door knocking around The Voice, and he made the comment that 7 out of 10 people opening the door didn't even know there was going to be a referendum. So I think that it is that process of starting a conversation at the coffee shops, in the schoolyards. It's doing it in a really authentic way, and being able to there are 3 things we're taught not to talk about: religion, money and politics. So we have to be trying to exert the okayness of having a conversation that comes from a political point of view. And that might take writing letters to newspapers, it might take encouraging journalists to do stories that are broader than just the pointy end. And I certainly think it also takes, as parents, talking to your school about what sort of civics education is going on for your kids in their school levels, and, trying to get a broader conversation going.
Great. Okay, so Zali, I'll just then give everybody else a chance. Then we're going to finish up with KPIs, because it's good to talk about this stuff and it's all good conversation. But the reality, I think, of what Sophie was saying, that the alternative is, what other countries have got when it's not working. So how can we put some markers in the sand to actually show this system is working? And
I guess it depends where your question is coming at. Is that to an independent, or as in to communities in our democracy? I think a sign the system is getting better or worse.
Sorry, Zali, you're frozen on my screen. Could you go back and say that again, Zali?
If I'm there, I
got you
think it
now.
depends on who you KPIs for, and I think everyone should be bound by KPIs. If it's a KPI on our democracy and engagement by community, or appetite for change is look at every election. Where does the primary vote go? Is it changing? And we saw at the last election, it was 30, 30, 40, right? 30% to each of the major parties, 40% to minor parties and independents. Let's make it the goal for the next election that it's 25, 25, 50, right? Let's keep pushing that dial. The KPI for an MP is, I think it's very important for an independent to stay very grounded on why you're there to represent your community. And it's very easy to be attracted to every issue, every shiny thing, but you have to remember first and foremost, you are there for your community. So to me, it's incredibly important that my number, if I'm having to weigh up a meeting request between an international group and a local community group, it's a local community group. You cannot ever get so caught up in the big issues that you take your community for granted. And because that's what the political parties have done for too long. They have MPs that are sort of tokenistic to their electorate, but then focused on whatever portfolio they have and whatever the big picture. So as an independent, first and foremost, that local presence, the listening is important. But in saying that, your electorate wants to have an impact on the national conversation. And so finding that way for your local voice to be a national voice is really important as well. And maybe this is my sporting days that kicks in, but for me, it's about prioritising and really picking those key issues and those areas where you can have difference. We have clear team building days planning where we plan 3, 6, 12 months out. We have layering of issues where some issues are light touch, right? We will do our bit. I will engage, try maybe amendments, but there's only so much resources to put to that issue. Other issues I will absolutely commit to championing and drive change and commit my resources to. And I think that's worked really well for me with the community. We, in terms of getting change, again, also KPIs, progress, major parties tend to get caught up in this idea that success is building a new hospital or a road, or how many dollar signs, how many numbers can you put behind a dollar sign? And that's led to corruption and pork barreling and a real moving away from merit. So to me, success is incremental. These issues are big issues, from Allegra's tax to climate. These things need incremental change. You have to call on your community to be patient, right? This is not going to get resolved overnight, but it is by being focused on set the goals, realize what you're trying to achieve, and then incrementally work at it. You will have setbacks. That is the normal course of things. When you get a setback, it's where you have to think of a plan B. How can you approach this problem in a different way? And so for all these community groups, everyone here, you're looking for solutions, and that's the only way we're going to bring more people along for this change, but also solve some of the really big challenges we have ahead.
Oh, thank you. So we're getting towards the end of this session and to the rest of the day. So we'll zip around the group. Final word. I think you can say anything you want, really, but I'll start with you, Kate, and then we'll go around the group again. And again, to the 183 plus people listening, and then the people watching the recording, and we're trying to put community at the centre of the ecosystem. So you've talked about permission, you've talked about difference. Any final word you want to put out there?
Yeah, I would like to, and it's a little bit theoretical, not quite so practical, but I would like to introduce the concept of political rewilding. And, conservational rewilding is getting rid of the invasive species, getting rid of the monoculture, and trusting that nature, the complexity of nature, will come up with resilient solutions. And I think what we're seeing here is a political equivalent to that, where if you're in a community, you are part of that complex, system that has its own resilience. So trust yourself, trust your instincts. Don't be afraid to bring ideas and put them on the table. If you do have an independent MP and you think of ways that you could support them in getting some action to happen, bring those ideas, because we don't have all the answers on how to best facilitate community action either. So that is also part of the job.
I love it. For those who've watched Alone, that Gina and the joy she took in being out there, she reminds me of all of you guys. Helen, what do you reckon?
Yeah, thanks, Cathy. I love the idea of political rewilding. I think that's effectively what the community independents have started and are doing. When I kind of think about how do we measure whether we're doing any good, really take on board what Zali's saying and understanding how to say no and how to have some impact. But also I really look at it at a micro level. How does my community feel? How many people are showing up to things? How many people are generating new ideas? Has the diversity at the various events changed? Are we able to create safe spaces? And ultimately, is what we're doing transferable and replicable? And I think if you look at the numbers of people in this forum this year compared to 1 year ago, or a bit over 1 year ago, this is replicable. And I think that's a hell of a KPI that's been ticked in the community independent movement.
Oh, lovely. Zoe, what do you reckon?
Thanks, Cathy. Thank you. And yes, love Kate's political rewilding, and, you know, we can grow great forests together, I think. The other thing that I would add in terms of KPIs, it goes to what Helen said, which is, how does the community feel? Do they feel genuinely heard, listened to and involved and engaged with what we're doing? And then the second piece is changing the national conversation. And certainly a big part of my motivation for running in the first place was what Helen and Zali had done in changing the national conversation around climate and integrity. It takes time, but that's a systems change that began long before we were in the parliament. And so I think to be generating that national conversation and creating that social license is a kind of intangible but really important part of the role of independence.
I just want to say, just before I pass to you, Monique, one of the funniest, oddest things in my experience. So I'm in Benalla today. I walked up the street to get a coffee before we started. Like 5 people wanted to stop and say hello. Hello, Cathy, how are you going? Thank you. And I said, yeah, Helen's doing a great job. Helen's doing a fantastic job. Like, I had no idea that I'd still be remembered, but remembered with enormous gratitude for the work I've done. And I just want to say something, because initially everyone said politics is too hard, you don't want to do it, it's a horrible job. Like, it's all those things about being busy, but the gratitude you get from your community of having done service, it just continues to surprise me how much it means to the young girl making coffee at the shop to say, thank you, you spoke at my school 6 years ago and I remember you. It's like, good. Anyhow, so it's what you say, it's slow, but you never underestimate, I think, the impact that you actually have. So, and Monique, even if you don't get re-elected, no one will ever forget what you've done. It's actually, you've done the work. Now, hopefully you will, of course, but just holding on to that. But anyhow, I divert. What is your message to everybody?
Well, it's a bit of all of the above, really, Cathy. It was funny, yesterday I was out in the electorate and I nearly got run over by somebody. He pulled over and he said, oh, I can't run over Monique Ryan. My wife would kill me. which made me laugh. Look, yeah, it's all of the above. I mean, I think this whole community thing, you guys started it. One of the excitements of it is we don't know where it's going to end. Like, none of us have any idea where it's going to go or where it's going to end, but all of us can make our own contribution in our own sphere and know that we're a part of something which has become an extraordinary movement around Australia. And yes, I just encourage everyone, just stay active, stay connected, you know, work out what you can do your thing, bring it to the people around you, and whatever is the thing that you are most passionate about, take it on board, work with it, share it with other people around you. Organically, we've seen the extent to which these things can grow. You know, stay active, stay involved. You know, and it does sometimes feel like, you know, you're not making gains, and that maybe those gains are incremental, but then all of a sudden you turn around and you've got a National Anti-Corruption Commission, and you've had 2 major pieces of legislation on climate passed in the last 12 months. So we are actually moving things more quickly even than we appreciate at times, I think.
And we'll get change on that student interest rate stuff, which is so bad. Okay, Kylea, what's your final additional words?
Can you hear me?
Yep. And see you.
And see me. Last point. You know, I just want to say that sometimes a KPI can just be turning up. And I think, you know, for me, Cathy, one of the things you said to me when I was running, and it fundamentally changed how I approached the entire campaign from that day forward. I was having a bad day, and you and I had a conversation, and I said to you, I was most upset because I felt, I'm going to get teary, I felt that I'd failed, that I'd let everybody down, you know, that I knew all these people had been working so hard to do what we were trying to do, and that I had failed and it wasn't going to work. And I remember you very clearly saying to me that day, Kylea, it's the last time you're allowed to use that word, because whether or not you make it to Canberra, you have won. Like, you've stood up and you've won today. You win every day you turn up and have a conversation. So, I mean, yeah, I think sometimes we have to be quite kind to ourselves and recognise that the KPI of just turning up is a pretty freaking huge KPI in our country at the moment, because there's a lot of people that don't turn up. So I love the idea of rewilding our political system. I think everybody on this call today is turning up. Like, thank you for turning up, and just take heart, you know, like, it is a day by day, minute by minute proposition, but we are creating a better democracy, and we're seeing it in the House. You know, we're seeing the way the debate is moving. We're seeing that level of accountability and integrity come to be. And yeah, it's just a privilege to be here. And I'm excited. For the first time, I mean, I think I'm excited for Australian politics for the next decade and a half, because I think we have a real chance here to show that when a community mobilises, you can take your country back and be the place you want to be.
Oh, great. And Zali.
Sorry, get off mute again. Look, also incredibly inspired. What to finish on? Well, I think you got to keep going. This is not something we can quit, right? Quitting is not an option. So as Kylea just said, you show up and, you know, and you keep trying. I think it is about, and you take inspiration and take support from everyone that's around you, because this is, you know, for all of us, whatever our motivations have been to get more political, to get more issues for our kids, for our grandkids, for Australia, for who we can be, there is just, it's really worth it. It is tiring at times. I think let's all be frank. There's, you know, as Monique said, and Zoe and everyone, it is full on, but it's incredibly rewarding, in particular when the community really engages and appreciates it. I will finish with school kids, especially young girls. One of my first meetings in 2019 was UNICEF had a group of young leaders, and they had a survey that said 0% of young women were interested in a career in politics. So now every school group I speak to, I ask the kids who is interested in politics. And if the young girls are not putting up their hand, I do ask them why. And, you know, reminding everybody that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so you have to be part of the decision making, or these decisions will be made and they will impact your lives. So well done, everybody, for being here, for listening, and get out there and tell a few more people.
So in bringing this session to a close, I want to just love you to bits. Thank you. And I just want to focus on this thing about the ecosystem. Ecosystems, it's a bit like what you're saying. They work when everybody does their job. Like the trees do their job of, you know, making magic happen. So it's a bit of us, all of us doing our job and knowing what our jobs are. And then what Helen was saying, that interconnection, introducing people to each other, connecting up with each other. So I just want to finish on that note today. Today's a really good chance for the 180 of us listening to connect. So we've got we've got the cafe happening, but also in the panel. Can you let other people know of your interests so people can read? And if you don't get a response once, do it again, because today's the day of networking and actually finding your soulmates who are going to work with you on these things, because they don't actually have to be in your own electorate. They can be in other areas. So in wishing you well, our MPs, I just want to extend that enormous sense of gratitude that we have got for you. And don't hesitate to call on us when you need us, because sometimes we don't know what you need, but there's all of us in our communities who will come, who will do anything you ask for us. So sometimes you're asking us to do stuff as well as just waiting. We will be there for you. So on that note, I'm going to pass back to Jill to take us through to the next session. And thank you for all those little hearts and claps coming up. That's really lovely. But on that note, I'll say goodbye and look forward to, catching up with you during the rest of the day. Jill, over to you.
Thanks, Cathy. Thank you enormously. That has been one of the most enriching conversations I've had on a Saturday morning for a very, very long time. Thank you very much. And Allegra had to leave, but it was lovely having the rest of you